All right. So today we are going to talk about developing an integrated weed management plan for your farm. Hopefully you've joined us for the previous three webinars. But if this is the only one of the series that you're attending, I think you'll still get a lot out of it. Before we get started, um, we'll do some introductions. My name is Sarah Runkle. I'm the local food program director at CFSA. My background is as a diversified vegetable farmer and ag educator. I've been with CFSA since 2022, and before that worked for cooperative extension in Oregon and in North Carolina. And I'll let Joe introduce himself. He's going to be monitoring the chat and dropping links and letting folks in today from the waiting room.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. Hey, everybody, Joe Rowland. I'm the Organic Initiatives Coordinator for Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. I have been or was an organic vegetable grower in the Charlotte area since 2010. Farmed at my own place for 10 years and then managed a couple other area farms until whatever 2022-ish when I came over to CFSA and started working with lovely farmers like yourself. So happy to be here. Reach out offline if there's anything we can do to help.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And want to recognize that this event is supported through the USDA Transition to Organic Partnership Program. CFSA is part of the Southeast Top Project, which is a program of USDA Organic Transition Initiative administered by USDA Ag Marketing Services and the National Organic Program. And a little bit about CFSA, if you're not familiar with Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, we are a member-based nonprofit working in North and South Carolina to advance sustainable food systems centered on local and organic agriculture through technical assistance, education, and advocacy. This is a diagram of all the different things that we do. So Joe and I are on the programs team that provides education like these workshops and technical assistance, one-on-one support to farmers on a variety of topics from organic production and certification to food safety, market access, conservation planning. We also have a farmer training program and business incubate and farm incubator in Concord. We have a policy team and we have an education team that puts together 2 conferences a year and the Piedmont Farm Tour. And I'll share some more slides about CFSA at the very end of the presentation, but want to make sure that we have plenty of time for the workshop today. So the goal for the webinar today is to really focus on how you can develop an integrated weed management plan for your farm, which includes understanding how to evaluate and monitor your plan and deciding how to prioritize weed management activities and investments for your operation. We are going to do a little bit of review at the beginning, just to refresh folks' memory about what we covered in the first 3 webinars, and then we'll really dig into what's involved in an integrated weed management plan, and then we'll talk through a couple of case studies where I'm hoping that y'all will participate in the discussion. All right, so why do we care about weeds? There are lots of different reasons why we care about weeds, but I think the main one for most gardeners and especially annual crop producers, vegetables, flowers, herbs, fruits, is because weeds compete with our crops and can decrease crop yields. They can be expensive to control. They can also be an alternate host for pests and diseases that can negatively impact our cash crops. If we let weeds mature, they can make harvest more difficult, which, is part of that, adding to the expense of farming, and then competing for resources, including nutrients, water, and space with our cash crops. Excuse me. When we talk about weed control, um, important to remember that most crops have this critical weed-free period, which is typically the early stage of a crop's life cycle where it's essential to maintain a weed-free environment to prevent yield loss. And so this critical weed-free period is going to vary depending on the specific crop. But, thinking through, the timing of weed management practices at the beginning of when a crop is becoming established, but we also need to think about weed management during the harvest period because allowing weeds to reproduce and mature and reproduce towards the end of a crop's development and in the harvest period can have a negative impact on both the harvestability of that crop and future production, especially if we're allowing annual weeds to go to seed and contribute to the weed seed bank, or some of these perennial weeds that can reproduce vegetatively. We're, exponentially expanding the weed populations for future crops, and that can compound over time and make weed management a real challenge for your operation. So when we think about timing of weed management, I think a lot of times we focus on that early stage of development of the crop, but it's important to remember that the harvest period is also an important time to control weeds. So many of you are probably familiar with the concept of integrated pest management. Integrated weed management is a similar concept, right? So we're emphasizing proactive or preventative strategies during the planning of the cropping system to minimize opportunities for weeds to become a problem. We're using a variety of practices. Often when we talk about integrated weed management, it's this many little hammers approach. So selecting multiple different strategies to manage weed populations and optimize crop growth to outcompete weeds, with a goal of employing the least toxic materials and the least ecologically disruptive tactics when possible. So a key part of the integrated weed management strategy is evaluation and monitoring. So it's really a whole cycle that goes from identification to implementing a variety of strategies, including preventative and reactive strategies, and then evaluation and monitoring to influence future decision making. It's important to note that the USDA National Organic Program requires certified organic growers to take this approach to pest management and to document both preventative and control measures, and your rationale for why you implemented them. Some key questions to ask yourself when developing an integrated weed management plan. What are your most problematic weeds? How well does your crop or crops, how well do they compete with the weeds that you have? How easy are those weeds to control in that particular crop? And then what tools do you already have available to manage weeds? And so some of these tools may be actual physical equipment, physical tools. And then we're going to talk about different strategies that are cultural control methods, prevention strategies that you can implement that may not require any specialized equipment. So let's review some of the things we talked about in the earlier sessions. So weed identification and understanding the weed life cycle and biology is really key to identifying the correct control strategies for the problematic weeds that you have. So understanding whether a particular weed is an annual, what kind of annual it is. Is it a summer annual, a winter annual, biennials like thistles and dock that can take, you know, up to 2 years to complete their life cycle, have different control strategies. And then there are a number of perennial weeds, both grasses and broadleaf weeds, that live more than 2 years and often reproduce vegetatively. So being able to identify your weeds and then also really understand how those weeds reproduce is critical for decision making when it comes to different uh, weed management strategies. So the two weeds here in the pictures, the top is Palmer amaranth, which is a summer annual. It really likes warm weather and germinates best in very warm soils. The plants are dioecious, meaning they have male and female plants, so they have to cross with each other. They have developed herbicide resistance, which has made them difficult to control for conventional farmers, as well as organic farmers. And they produce a lot of seeds. So a single female plant can produce 100,000 to 1,000,000 seeds. And so that, you know, just letting one or two mature in your field can quickly create a large problem for the next season, or even in, you know, long season crops. They can reseed and germinate multiple times within a cropping cycle. The picture on the bottom is of yellow nutsedge. I would imagine that a number of you have yellow nutsedge on your farm. It can be a common weed in the Carolinas. And if you have it, you know that it's a problem. So it does not do well in terms of seed reproduction, but it grows these extensive underground networks of rhizomes and tubers, and they can produce a lot of tubers in a single year. So up to 7,000 tubers, and those tubers can survive in the soil for up to 10 years. So once you have it, it can be challenging to control, and we're going to talk about it in more depth later in the presentation. There are a lot of great weed identification resources out there. This book, Weeds of the South, is a good resource. There are some good websites. You know, Clemson has a good weed identification website that has some information about the weed biology. Virginia Tech has a good website. And then also want to highlight, it's not on the slide, but Cornell University Weed Science Program has some really good information, especially about ecological weed management, and they have weed profiles. Joe, if you can drop that link in the chat, and we'll share all of these resources in a follow-up email with folks. All right, so now we're going to review some different control strategies. We've talked about all of these in the previous webinars, but just want to remind folks of all of the different options for weed control. So when we talk about preventative controls, we're really focused on limiting the weed's ability to spread and reducing the chances of weed seed germination and growth. So there are a number of different strategies you can implement, including mowing, managing your field edges so that weeds don't mature and go to seed, and then blow into your fields or onto your compost pile. Making sure that you're roguing weeds so that nothing goes to seed. One thing that folks, I think, could do a better job at is, you know, inspecting your inputs. So everything from your cover crop seed to your compost to your mulch, like really thinking about whether or not that particular input could be a source for introducing new weeds to your farm. Minimizing bare ground. We know that most weeds are Colonizers, they take advantage of bare ground and warm soil and exposure to light to germinate and grow. And they're very good at taking up nutrients and putting on a lot of growth very quickly and out competing our existing our cash crops. Mulch, so whether it's plastic mulch or landscape fabric or um, cardboard or between row mulch, sawdust or straw, right? Like the goal with mulch is to cover the soil and limit light exposure to um, reduce the amount of weed seeds that germinate. Limiting soil disturbance can be really helpful because if you have a lot of weed seeds in your soil, disturbing the soil can bring weed seeds up to the surface where they're more likely to germinate. And then cleaning equipment is a really good sanitation tool so that you're not spreading weed seeds or plant parts around your farm. Kind of building on preventative strategies, there are cultural control strategies that can make it difficult for weeds to be successful or give cash crops an advantage. So these includes things like water management. So, putting in drip tape versus overhead irrigation so that you're watering the crop specifically and not the weeds in the pathways. Utilizing techniques like stale seed bedding or tarping, solarization to either heat up the soil and kill weed seeds or any weed pieces, plant pieces that are close to the soil surface, or flushing a lot of weed seeds and then knocking them back. Um, Optimizing correct planting seeding dates and seeding rates for your crops. Deciding whether you're going to direct seed or utilize transplants as a way to provide a competitive advantage to your cash crops. Making sure that you have proper plant spacing, right? So that your cash crops aren't too crowded, but when they mature, that they or provide a full canopy that can help shade out weed seeds and reduce weed seed germination. Practices like cover cropping and crop rotation can be utilized as part of a weed management plan. Similar to water management, properly managing your nutrients to optimize plant growth without overfeeding weeds. So providing, slow release nitrogen over the course of the season as opposed to, one big application of nitrogen early on that your cash crops, when they're very small, are not going to be able to utilize, but any weeds that germinate and grow will certainly take advantage of. And then minimizing that soil disturbance as well. There are some biological control strategies that farmers are using. These are not as common, but can play a part in an integrated weed management plan for your farm. These can be things like utilizing biocontrol organisms. So whether it's a specific fungus or bacterium, virus, or insects that you introduce that are known to eat or have a negative effect on certain weed species. So this image on the top left is of a hawk moth caterpillar larva feeding on leafy spurge. Weed seed predation, if you have a lot of weed seeds in your fields, right? Optimizing the environment for things like beetles, ground beetles, and crickets, and even mice in certain cases are known to feed on weed seeds and can significantly reduce weed seed quantities in your field. And then grazing certain livestock can also be beneficial. So, cattle, goats, sheep, multi-species grazing can be a strategy for helping to control certain weeds in your operation. Mechanical control strategies. I think this is what most people think of when we talk about weed management. They're like, what kind of cultivator should I use? Or what kind of, hand tool am I going to be using for weeding my crop? This is, we're talking about, the tools and strategies that physically destroy or remove weeds from the cropping system. And with our cultivation mechanical tools, right, they're different actions that those tools take. And they can be on, from small scale hand tool size up through, tractor mounted toolbars, through specialized cultivating tractors, right? So there's tools that do all of these different actions, whether it's cutting and slicing weeds like a hula hoe, um, or on a larger scale with the tractor mounted equipment using side knives that slice under the soil surface. Tools that will uproot small weeds, tine weeders, basket weeders are good examples of that. There are some tools that do multiple actions. So things like sweeps will, undercut weeds in the soil, but they also throw soil. So they can be used to help cover very small weeds kind of in row, which is often a difficult place to manage weeds with mechanical cultivation. And there are also tools that damage weeds. So flame weeders are a great example of this, where we're using the flame to heat up the plant until the cell walls burst. We're not burning the plant to a crisp, but it damages the plant so that it will die. With these mechanical control strategies, early weed identification and management is really critical. So all of those different actions and strategies that I just mentioned really work best when weeds are in the white thread stage. So these are when they have just germinated, right? And so you can see here the picture on the left. To the right of the penny, there are these two weeds that have just germinated, and you can see the two seed leaves have just germinated, and there's just this one long white thread. Versus to the left of the penny, these weeds are still very small, but you can see how established that root system already is. And so the bigger the weed, the harder it is to control. And so being able to identify those weeds and implement your control strategies early on will be much more effective than waiting until the weeds get larger. And then last but not least, we did talk about in the last session some organic chemical control strategies. It's important to note that the options for organic herbicides are relatively limited and they can be expensive. These chemicals are still a pesticide, even if they're approved for use in organic production systems, and the label is the law. So you need to understand the application rate and make sure you wear the proper, personal protective equipment. All of the organic chemical control strategies are non-selective contact herbicides. So things like, 20% acetic acid, the vinegar that's sold as an herbicide. A lot of these are, acid-based products, and they will damage any foliage it comes in contact with, including your crops. They work best on small annual weeds, so after they have emerged from the soil and at higher temperatures in full sun. Because they are just a contact herbicide, they don't move through the plant like conventional herbicides do. So they're really not effective on large established annuals or on perennials. So let's move on to talking about how to create an integrated weed management plan for your farm. You want to start with your goals, which I think for most folks are to optimize crop yield and quality, and to minimize future weed competition with your intended crops. Um, Next, you need to identify your weeds. So this includes observing weed populations year round because we know that different weeds germinate under different conditions, summer annuals versus winter annuals. Biennials look very different in their first year of growth and their second year of growth. And so, sometimes identification is easier at different life stages of the plant. Um, Once you've observed your weeds, create a weed hotspot map of your fields, right? So, do you know that, in this particular field, you have a giant patch of Canada thistle that you need to manage, or nutsedge, or do you know that you have a bunch of Galansoga in a field, right? So, um, just like you would have a production map, you can even overlay on your production map, right? Like what your weed hotspots are, and then identify the most problematic weeds and really get to know them. So understand how they reproduce. I highly recommend that Cornell website that was shared in the chat because not only do they talk about weed biology characteristics, they also have a lot of information on strategies for managing those weeds. So once you've identified your weeds, you're going to select a combination of strategies to meet your goals, right? And so we're not going to select just one thing that we're going to do for all weeds and all crops on your farm because it's unlikely that just having one strategy, like we're just going to use black plastic for all of our crops, is going to effectively manage weeds in the most ecologically minded way for all of the different weeds that you have on your farm and the different crops that you're growing. So we're going to look to select a combination of proactive strategies, reactive strategies. We'll talk about these in a couple slides. Think about the cost of a particular strategy versus the reward, and then plan our weed control from the pre-plant stage through post-harvest. So it's not just a one-time strategy, right? Like weed management needs to be implemented throughout your growing season. When I worked at Oregon State University Extension, a colleague and I developed this weed management planning worksheet, and it's very small, but I'll be sending it as a PDF to everyone in a follow-up email. But it basically outlines and provides kind of like a pick list for you to select some strategies and create a map and think through the different stages of your crop development. So in the top left corner, there's space for, identifying the field name, what the crop or crops are, what your row and plant spacing is, when it's going to be planted, what was in that field beforehand, and then what are the worst weeds in that particular field. The center box is to sketch a field map and note any weedy hotspots. On the bottom left, we've got strategies at your disposal. So picking, you can pick from proactive strategies like crop rotation or implementing proper nutrient management for your crop, solarization, as well as reactive strategies like mechanical cultivation or mowing or grazing livestock. And then the last box is to list the strategies that you plan to use throughout the season. So before you plant, at planting, when the crop's developing, when the crop's full sized, before harvest, and then after harvest. So it's really a robust way of thinking about weed management for your farm based on kind of field and crop specific conditions. Really like this approach of, we talked about all these different strategies, whether it's, sanitation and prevention, cultural control, biological, mechanical, chemical control, right? but then grouping those different strategies based on whether they're a proactive approach or a reactive approach. So how can we, with these proactive strategies, really get ahead of the weeds and optimize the conditions for our crops to grow? So whether that's, planting a cover crop that is going to outcompete weeds so that, the weed seeds don't germinate. Maybe there's more time for those seed predators to eat those weed seeds. Or the cover crop has an allelopathic effect, which can prevent those weed seeds from germinating in the future. To things like mowing, right? So if you do have weeds that get big, can we mow them or weed whack them so that they're not going to seed and creating more of a problem down the road? And then there are reactive strategies. So once you have the weeds, right, what are you going to do to minimize those weeds so that they're not competing with your crops and impacting yield and potentially quality or your ability to harvest those crops? So I think when we think about weed management, it's these reactive strategies that we're often focused on. So everything from hand pulling to all our different cultivation and tillage, flame weeding. Some folks have had success using livestock like geese and chickens who like to eat small weeds and even weed seeds. Be cautious with this strategy. You don't want to be putting poultry into areas where you're actively growing crops, especially like fresh vegetable crops where their feces could come into contact with the part of the plant that you're eating. So we've got the proactive and the reactive strategies. And then last but not least, thinking through how are we going to monitor and evaluate the strategies that we've chosen and implemented so that we can make informed decisions for future seasons, right? So conditions change from year to year. It's really important to make time to monitor for new weeds and emerging weed problems. You may already be doing, weekly field walks, or you're walking the field to identify what's ready for harvest. Could you, or you're doing a pre-harvest food safety risk assessment, right? Could you add in a place to take some notes about any new weeds or emerging weed problems on your farm? Use that information to update your weed field maps. This could be in real time. This could be at the end of the season. I would encourage you to do as much of this kind of record keeping in real time as possible, because it's hard to keep all that information in your head with everything else that you're managing as a farmer or a gardener. And recognize that no one tool or strategy is going to fit all situations on a farm unless you are truly just growing one crop and you really just have, one weed on your farm, right? So you're really going to need to select a variety of these strategies and try to keep notes on what has worked well and what hasn't worked. And then make time to incorporate this integrated weed management planning into your annual production planning process. So as you're thinking about, your crop rotation, where certain crops are going to go, is there, did you have a problem with Galansoga going to seed in your potatoes at harvest, right? And so is that going to be a problem next year if you want to grow carrots in that field, right? Maybe you want to plant something else where it's easier to manage weeds if you know that the previous crop dropped a lot of weed seed. Conditions always change, but I say, it's better to have a plan and have a kind of a toolkit of strategies that you can implement than wait until weeds are already a problem on your farm. When you're implementing, that annual integrated weed management planning, you really need to ask yourself, like, is your current integrated weed management plan working? If you have weeds coming back year after year, ask yourself, like, why aren't these strategies working, right? So, like, if you're gonna, you know, spray vinegar on a Galansoga when it's already mature and dropping seed, you're already killing a plant that's dying. Like, it's the problem has already happened, so you're just wasting money and time on that spray material. Are you tilling plants that reproduce through rhizomes, right? So not only can that multiply the plant, but if you're not good at cleaning your equipment between fields, you can move that plant material around your farm and introduce weeds to other parts of your operation. Or if you're borrowing equipment from somebody, right? Like, make sure you clean that equipment before you use it, because you don't want to bring in new weeds to your operation from outside of your farm. And then recognize that it can take more than one season to eradicate weed infestations, especially with some of these more problematic weeds that drop a lot of seed, weeds that have seed that can survive in the soil for a long time. A lot of the perennial weeds can take multiple years to really get control of. So as you're thinking through these different strategies, right, I encourage you to think about, like, what are tools or practices that you already utilize that you can implement as part of your integrated weed management plan. But there may be a case where you want to invest in new equipment or invest in new strategies. And so some questions to ask yourself as part of this process, right, is, like, really identifying what your current cost of weed management is, whether that's, like, equipment that you have already. What are your labor costs related to weed management on your farm? If you're doing a lot of um, hand tool work, that might be appropriate for your scale, but is there maybe a wheel hoe or, a different piece of equipment that not only could speed up the process, but maybe is more ergonomic or easier for the operator to use so they don't get worn out so quickly. Also think about lost opportunity, right? So if you um, have challenges with weeds, is that limiting your ability to optimize harvest or implement rapid succession plantings? Certainly, are weeds impacting yields of crop on your farm? So it's not just the cost of managing the weeds, but it's also what's the negative impact on your cash crops that weeds have on your operation. When thinking about equipment investment, I find it helpful to think about whether or not the tool can be adapted. Is it something that can be used on more than one crop? Is it effective on different types of weeds? Does it fit in your current production system, right? So you likely have a standardized, bed width and row setup. And so if your beds are set up with 60 inches from center to center, wheel spacing, like, make sure that if you're going to buy equipment, that it fits that particular bed width and wheel spacing for your equipment, for your operation. Or if you're going to invest in some cultivation tools, and you use a 3-row system, like, don't buy a basket weeder that's set up for a 4-row system unless you are willing to change your planting spacing to fit that particular piece of equipment. Do you have the staff capacity to utilize the equipment, right? And so do you have staff available that can be trained to operate equipment? Does it have other benefits, right? Are there, multiple uses for that piece of equipment? And does it scale appropriate, right? So the equipment that you invest in, if you're a 1 acre market gardener, is going to be very different than equipment you might invest in if you're growing 20 acres of diversified vegetables. Equipment that you use for annual vegetable production is probably going to be different than equipment that you might select if you're doing like perennial berries or have an orchard where you're buying equipment to manage weeds in that perennial system. For some of our proactive strategies like cover cropping and crop rotation, you're likely already implementing those practices for other reasons, right? So cover cropping to build soil organic matter, crop rotation to reduce disease and pest and disease pressure between different crop families. But you can also prioritize weed management as a goal of those practices. So, choosing cover crops, summer cover crops like buckwheat or Sudan grass that can quickly outcompete weeds that might be trying to grow in a particular area. Rotating crops, thinking about crops where weeds are easy to control versus where they're not, or crops that don't compete well with weeds versus ones that do. These are all, additional things you can think about when implementing cover cropping and crop rotation. In some cases, you may decide to implement kind of like more extended cover cropping or crop rotation where you have your land out of cash crop production to focus on strategies like bare fallowing or cover cropping specifically to manage weeds. And so you need to think about like what's the cost benefit of having that land out of production so that you can get a handle on the weed population versus if you're trying to grow a crop in that field, like how likely is it to be successful given the weed problems that you have in that particular field. This is a visual tool that I came up with just to help think through kind of like the cost versus the reward of different strategies that you might choose, and like how you fill this out is going to be different for every farmer based on the particular weeds that you have, the crop that you're growing, what equipment you have, right? What resources you have on hand for managing weeds. But it's really thinking about like what is the cost for managing weeds or implementing a particular strategy. And so on the left-hand side, we see, at the top, low cost things, right? So minimal labor or minimal or no equipment or supplies. To things that are start getting more costly, right? Taking cropland out of production to specifically manage weeds. And then high cost could be practices that require a lot of labor, like hand weeding, or you're investing in expensive equipment or supplies, right? So we've got cost on the left, and then on the bottom we have kind of the reward, which is specific to optimizing crop yield and reducing weed pressure over time. And so low reward would be a practice that increases weed pressure in the future, or you have crop failure due to that weed pressure. Higher reward, right? Like maybe you don't have crop failure, but you have reduced yields. And then highest reward, some examples would be, less weed pressure in the future, optimal crop yields, other benefits like cover cropping, right? That can also increase soil organic matter, or with legume cover crops, right? They're also fixing nitrogen for future crops to use. And so I'd be interested to know if like other folks have really thought through this process and really thinking about specific to like a weed. In this case, I've got like Galansogo, which is a summer annual, and we're growing direct seeded carrots, right? And so, what are some potential strategies, and are they going to be, high reward, low cost? Can you plant those carrots after a crop where weeds were very well managed? Or maybe, slightly higher cost, but also high reward. You're doing a stale seed bed technique where you're flushing weeds and flame weeding weeds on that bed before the carrots germinate, um, versus, low reward, but, I guess this should actually be in low cost too, right? Because if you just let weeds go to seed at the end of the season, um, you know, that's not necessarily costing you anything, but it's also going to lead to more weed pressure in the future. So just a kind of a framework for thinking about how to choose different strategies and also think through where it might make sense to invest in certain equipment. So now we're going to talk through some case studies. The first one, which I think is probably a familiar scenario for a lot of beginning farmers, is that you're going to convert, an old field to vegetable production. So you've recently purchased land to establish a vegetable farm. The land has been in unmanaged pasture for an unknown number of years. After walking the field in the fall, you observe a mix of established grasses. You see some yellow dock going to seed, some Canada thistle, some bindweed. There's even some multiflora rose growing. So some real challenges here, right? So what steps would you take to prepare the land to grow vegetables with weed management in mind? So the next one to talk about is with perennial berries. This could be with an orchard management too. So in this case, I've got some pictures here of blueberry production. But so the scenario is you plan to plant 2 acres of organic blueberries in an area where you previously had well-managed pasture, where you grazed cattle and mowed hay. So mostly a mix of grasses and legumes, no multiflora rose or dock, right? So what are some weeds that you might expect to see as you make the transition from pasture to a perennial crop like blueberries? And then the last scenario to talk about is for annual vegetable production. You have an organic diversified farm where you grow a wide variety of crops for direct to consumer markets, spring, summer, and fall. You have 5 acres in production divided into 5 1-acre fields. You rotate your fields by, plant family, and typically plant everything into a cover crop in the fall. But you have a yellow nutsedge problem in one of your fields. So, what do you know about yellow nutsedge and why is it a problematic weed? We're getting towards the end of our time together, so I want you to think about, now what, right? So we've talked about, identification, prevention, and sanitation strategies are biological, physical, and chemical control options, how to think about developing an integrated weed management plan where we're applying all multiple strategies to manage weeds on your farm. So I highly encourage everyone to come to our organic weed management field day on June 2nd. If you're available, it's going to be a great day. We've got a bunch of demonstration plots set up. Tillmore Equipment is planning to come. They'll be bringing their Super E, their electric cultivating tractor, and their Power Ox walk behind tool, and some other equipment. So we'll have a lot of different stuff set up, and you'll be able to see a lot of strategies in action. If you haven't already created weed hotspot maps for your fields, I encourage you to do that. So now is a good time to start. You were kind of on the tail end of our, winter annuals are dying back, and our summer annuals have germinated and are starting to grow. So again, thinking about your weeds throughout the season. Use the resources to identify your weeds and learn about them. And then really think about why you have a weed problem. So, what are the strategies that you can implement? What are some things you can change in your management that will decrease the weed population on your farm? Then you're going to determine most appropriate controls based on the biology of your weeds, your plans, and your resources. I would encourage you to pick 2 crops for the season and complete a weed management plan worksheet that I'll be emailing you all. Again, that like map and information about the crop and the weeds, picking your strategies, thinking through from pre-plant to post-harvest, what strategies you're going to implement, and really put that plan to work. And then monitor your farm for weeds on a continual basis. Just a little bit more about CFSA. So for our programs team, we, in addition to workshops, do a lot of one-on-one technical assistance. So Joe does a lot of work with organic production, helping farmers prepare an organic systems plan if you want to become certified organic. Conservation planning, whether that's under like an NRCS contract, or identifying conservation objectives for your operation. High tunnel production, so both accessing NRCS equip programs and also just like general troubleshooting for high tunnels. And we do a lot of food safety technical assistance and education, so helping farmers prepare for a third-party food safety audit or putting together a farm food safety plan. We also do market access work, and then we're just starting this climate resilience technical assistance program where we're helping farms, identify what their climate risks are and develop a whole farm resilience plan, thinking about like what practices fit your operation best when it comes to implementing climate resilient strategies for your operation. All of those technical assistance services are free to CFSA members. We are a membership-based organization. We have around 3,000 members, predominantly farmers across North and South Carolina, but welcome members that are supporters of the food system to farmers as well. And we do have a lot of great member benefits. So in addition to, workshops like this and technical assistance, we have job boards and listservs. We also have a member advocacy program if you're interested in learning how to be a better kind of advocate to your representatives about why sustainable and organic agriculture is important. And then we have a member perks program where we have a number of businesses that have offered to give discounts to CFSA members. Membership is very affordable. For farms, it's $40 a year to be a member of CFSA. We have lots of different ways to be involved. We have an events calendar. Our website has a ton of resources and information about how to become a member. We have a monthly newsletter that goes out. You don't have to be a member to get our newsletter. So encourage folks to get involved. And I want to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. And if you've been at the other webinars in the series, really appreciate your time. If you have any additional feedback you want to share with us or questions, feel free to reach out to either myself or Joe. Our emails are on the screen. And hopefully we'll see you in Greensboro on the 2nd.